run a dyslexic centre. She's been a teacher in charge of a language resource base, and she's run an outreach service for a special school federation. But she also understands our role in governance because she was an SEN governor for 10 years and also for 4 years as a chair. So I'm not going to take up any more of this precious time that we have. I'm going to hand over to her. We are going to record this session so that you can share it with other members of your governing body or your committees. That will be up on the website tomorrow. You will see on the website some material from NASEN. I encourage you to go and have a look there. If you have questions, please pop them into the chat as we go through the presentation. Alex will do her very best to get to them today, but if we don't get to them this evening, then we will follow up with them onto the website. If you can all make sure you're on mute, and I'll hand over to you. Thanks very much, Alex.
Thanks very much, Claire, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. It's great to be here. As Claire said, was a governor myself for 10 years as an SEN governor. It was as a parent governor of a primary school, and I was chair and vice chair before that as well. So I do understand where you're coming from. And so I really hope to present it from a governor's perspective. Hopefully everybody can see the screen now, so please let me know if you can't, and please make sure you've switched off your mics. So there's an awful lot to get through in an hour, because when we're looking at special educational needs now and what that means, both broadly and in terms of governance, there's an awful lot of information. So what I'm going to attempt to address is what NASEN is and what it does. What SEN means essentially, and what's included within that understanding of special educational needs. And then we're going to look at how pupils with SEN may have been affected by the lockdowns over this last year, and how perhaps you can support them to catch up, which I've put in inverted commas, which we'll come to later, and what we as governors can do to support this. So as Claire said, I'm sure you will have questions. Please put them in the chat, because I very much doubt that there'll be very much time to actually answer them this evening directly, just because of the amount of information that there is to get through. But I absolutely intend to answer them in writing, which I will email to Claire and David to share with everybody. What I will also do is any links that I refer to or that that are on the screen, I will also put in that document so that you have those. You don't have to worry about writing those down. You'll have those sent through as well. Okay, so just about NASEN to start with. NASEN actually stands for National Association of Special Educational Needs. So we're a not-for-profit organisation, or charity if you prefer. We've been around for, I think it's 28 years now. NASEN actually started the same year that I started in my teaching career, which is quite nice. And we support all educational practitioners to meet the needs of all pupils. But as well as, and by education practitioners, we include governors within that, and we do have materials and resources on our website specifically for governors. We do lots of CPDL, which stands for Continuing Professional Development and Learning, so lots of training for teachers. We provide them with lots of resources and information. We help to make sure that they are as up to date as they can possibly be with what's going on in the world of SEND, because you're probably very well aware that education changes a lot all the time, and it can be quite hard to keep up. So one of the main things that we do for the people who are members of NASEN is we help them to feel confident that they're up to date with latest information and developments in the world of SEND. We have free membership now. So if you've known of NASEN in the past, people used to pay for different levels of membership. That's now changed. So membership is entirely free. So there's absolutely no reason why every single school shouldn't be signed up. Definitely SENCOs within your schools need to be signed up, and probably senior leaders as well. And I would include governors in that. So by signing up, it means you get access to all the resources on the NASEN website. You get regular email updates so that you know you are up to date. And you can also access things like we publish a magazine called NASEN Connect. You can access the online version of that magazine. So there are lots and lots of things to read and things to look at, resources that actually support teachers and others with their jobs, all free. So no reason why you shouldn't sign up for that. That's what the website looks like. It's been refreshed recently. So again, if you've been on it before, it looks slightly different. It looks a lot better than it used to. And we've tried to make it more user-friendly for people. So again, sign up and you can browse all the different things on the website and find out what's useful to you. We do have some paid for what we call subscriptions. So aimed at different people really. So we have a publication subscription. So for people who are particularly interested in research, that gives people access to 3 research journals, which we help to publish, as well as providing access to the physical magazine. So if you sign up to that, the actual magazine comes through your door every 2 months. We have what we call an annual webinar pass. So over the last year, you'll be aware that all training has moved online. So we have a huge range of webinar events across the year, over 70, which people can either access live or they can access the recordings. And if people pay for an annual webinar pass, it makes that very, very good value for money at something like £5 per webinar, or possibly even less. It's really good value for money, particularly for SENCOs and school leaders. We have a SENCO support service, which is specifically for SENCOs. And again, that's a paid for service. So if you have particularly a new SENCO or a less experienced SENCO in your school, then that's the service that they can use to find information online, which is specific to that service. But they can also get email and telephone support from our education team as well. So really valuable. We also have an international membership, but I don't think in Wiltshire that you'll be particularly needing to use that. We have another website which is linked to the NASEN website, which is called the SEND Gateway. Again, that's been around for a few years, so you may have come across it before, but it's also been refreshed, so it looks slightly different. And this is the home of Whole School Send. So my role in NASEN currently is head of Whole School Send. Whole School Send is a consortium of which NASEN is the leading partner. A consortium of about 50 organisations across the SEND world, so organisations with focusing on, say, dyslexia and autism and so on, but also people for parent-led organisations, multi-academy trusts, universities and so on. And at the moment, our main piece of work is actually delivering on a DFE funded contract, which means everything delivered through Whole School Send is free to schools because it's funded by the Department for Education. So again, on the website, you can search all the resources that we produce and events that we run, and you can find out about the consortium partners. Everything on the SEND Gateway is completely free to schools. So again, it's well worth having a look on there yourself, and there are things on there specific for governors, but also encouraging SENCOs and the rest of the school team to have a look on there as well and use what's freely available to them. One of the important aspects of the of Whole School Send is that we have a regional model. So there are 8 regions across England. They're the same regions that the regional schools commissioners use. So one of which is the southwest, as you can see on there, which is where Wiltshire sits. So you can sign up to have contact with the regional team within the Southwest. And so there's some information on the slide. That's a page from our website. So if you want to find out more about the Southwest team in particular, have a look on that page. And if you sign up to receive the Whole School Send e-newsletter, that will keep you up to date with all the developments in Whole School Send as well as with NASEN. So that's a very quick intro to NASEN and Whole School Send. So now we're going to get into the sort of the meat of special educational needs and disabilities, as it were. And I am sure that many of you will already be quite familiar with some of this information, but I never like to assume that everybody is, because there may be new governors or less experienced.
Got a reasonable amount.
Sorry.
So,
Everybody turn their mic
we
off.
know that.
Thank you. Thank you. It's just easier for people to hear. So I thought it's really important that we start by looking at the legislation and the statutory guidance that guides most of what we do within the world of special educational needs and disabilities. And it's really important that you as governors have an understanding of the legal responsibility that we have and the statutory guidance that we need to make sure that schools are following. So the Children and Families Act was the piece of legislation from which the SEND Code of Practice was developed. So the SEND Code of Practice is the statutory guidance to the Children and Families Act. And that, don't worry too much about that, but it is a distinction. And so it's important to just be clear that there is this Code of Practice is not legislation itself, but it is statutory guidance, which means maintained schools must have regard to it. And there are several key principles within both of those. And it's important, again, to just have an understanding of what these key principles are. So one of them is person-centred working. And that essentially means that the child and the family around that child should be at the centre of everything we do. So everything that we do shouldn't be led by the system or led by processes or led purely by professionals, but they should be led by what that child and that individual family needs and desires. So it's really important that we listen to children and their families. And that doesn't mean that we have to do everything that they say. That's not what person-centred working means. But it does mean we listen to those views and we take them on board and we take them into account when we're making decisions, and that children, where appropriate, and their families are involved in that decision making right from the very start. Right as soon as it's thought that a child may have a special educational need, it's really important that we engage with their families right from the very start. Something else that this legislation and guidance brought in, which previously had been less prominent, is the joined up approach between education, health and care. So the Children and Families Act and the SEND Code of Practice are not just for schools to follow, but actually health and social care also have responsibilities within those as well. And it should very much be a joined up approach, both at that very high strategic level across the local area, but also when we come down to working with an individual child. So lots of children with SEND, as well as having educational needs, may also have health needs in the broadest sense. So, for example, if a child has a speech and language difficulty, speech and language therapists are usually employed by the health authority, so that falls under the health umbrella. And some children will also have social care needs, whether that's to do with requiring respite, for example, or other forms of social care support. Maybe they're a looked after child, for example. So it's really important that we adopt a joined up approach. Another really important key theme is that of early identification and intervention. So it's crucial that we are looking to identify children's needs as early as we possibly can. Now, ideally, that means within the early years, but it might also mean as early as soon as they become a parent. So some children's needs don't become apparent until they get older, perhaps not even until they start secondary school. That doesn't mean we can't do early identification. It means as soon as they are presenting with a need, the school is identifying that there may be a special educational need here, and then is putting support or intervention in place. So as soon as a need is identified, something should be put in place. It's what we'd call special educational provision is put in place, which might mean a specific intervention. It might mean a different level of support from adults. It might mean a different approach needed from teachers in the classroom. That could cover a whole range of things, but getting it in early makes a huge difference to outcomes for children. No doubt you'll be able to think of children yourselves where perhaps maybe that hasn't happened, and the consequences can be really quite dire for some children in some cases. You know, in the very worst examples, children ending up being excluded from school and possibly not attending school, possibly going to entering the justice system, for example, in the most extreme cases. So that's really key. Another change that this legislation brought in from the previous change is that behaviour is no longer a category of special educational need. Children's behaviours are an indication of a need. Okay, children communicate, well, all of us do actually, but children in particular communicate through their behaviours. So the behaviour is if you like, a symptom of a need rather than a need in itself. So we don't find the term behaviour used as a definition of need. Instead, we look at mental health. Social, emotional and mental health is what we're looking at now, rather than behaviour when we're looking at identifying types of needs. And the final one to mention here is that every teacher is a teacher of SEND. So it's not just about the SENCO. The SENCO does not hold all the responsibility for children with SEND. Every teacher in every classroom, whether you are working in reception class, year 6 or year 11, whether you're teaching an A-level group in Key Stage 5, you will have children and young people in your class at some point with some kind of special educational need or disability. So we are all responsible for those children. The other piece of legislation, which I will just go through very, very quickly, but you need to be aware of it, is the Equality Act of 2010. So you probably know that there are protected characteristics that fall under the Equality Act, and one of those is disability. So we have a legal responsibility to make sure that reasonable adjustments are put in place to meet the needs of those children or young people who have a disability. And you may be surprised that the definition of disability is wider than you perhaps realise, because it includes things like autism and ADHD. So it's not just the visible disabilities, but also some of the less visible, or sometimes called invisible disabilities, are included within this Act. And one of the important things to remember about making reasonable adjustments is that the duty is anticipatory. So there's a legal requirement to think ahead about what needs a child with a disability might have, and to put those reasonable adjustments in place before that child starts in the school, ideally, if that's appropriate. So it's just really important to be aware that there is a legal responsibility on schools to comply with the Equality Act. So what do we mean by special educational needs, and what do we mean by disability, and what is the difference between the two? Well, this is the definition of a special educational need taken from the Code of Practice, which I'll let you read. So it's a little bit of a circular definition, if you like. So the key part of identifying a child with a special educational need is, does that child require special educational provision to be made? And by special educational provision, we mean something which is different to or additional to what is being provided for all other children. So if all children are being provided with inclusive, high quality teaching, fantastic. All children might have the opportunity to join in with classroom-based intervention groups, for example, perhaps a reading group or some extra math support. That doesn't necessarily mean they've got special educational needs, because that's something which is available to all children. However, if, for example, after attending an extra reading group, it becomes apparent that there's a child who's not making progress despite having had good teaching and additional intervention, that might be the point at which the teacher starts to consider, do they have a special educational need? Because they need more than we're offering them at the moment. So it's the requiring special educational provision is the key to that definition. Disability is slightly different. I'll let you read that definition. And again, the key there is for something to be classed as a disability, it has to have a long-term and substantial adverse effect. So, for example, breaking your leg is disabling, but it's not a disability because it will resolve itself in the short term. So it's that long-term and substantial adverse effect. So somebody with, so my son had mild epilepsy when he was younger, but we didn't count that it wasn't a disability because it didn't have a substantial adverse effect on him because he only had seizures in the night. But some children with severe epilepsy, it would be counted as a disability because it would have that substantial adverse effect on their day-to-day life. Okay. So and some children with special needs also have a disability. Some children with a disability also have special needs. There's an overlap in the middle, but not everybody with a disability also has SEN. It's quite complex. Don't worry too much. Hopefully your SENCO has a really good understanding of that. Within the SEND Code of Practice, there are what they call 4 broad areas of need that all children who are identified with SEN will fall under one of these as their primary area of need. Most children, in fact, have areas going across more than one of these, but it's about what's their primary area of need. So when the school sends in census information every January, part of the information that they send in is how many children do they have with special educational needs and what's their primary area of need. So that they will come under one of these 4 broad areas. The first one is communication and interaction. So that includes the 2 main categories within that are children with a speech, language and communication need, or SLCM, and children with autism or an autism spectrum disorder or an autism spectrum condition, ASD or ASC, because those types of need mainly affect somebody's ability to communicate and interact with others. The second area is called cognition and learning. Cognition simply means thinking. So this is children with learning difficulties. Learning difficulties can be general. So they may include moderate learning difficulties, severe learning difficulties, or very complex learning difficulties. And if somebody has a general learning difficulty, then they have difficulties across all areas of learning. So for somebody with Down syndrome, for example, is classed as having a severe learning difficulty. Some people will have a specific learning difficulty where learning is only really affected in one particular area. So something like dyslexia is a specific learning difficulty because the person's learning is only affected in the area of reading and writing and associated areas, and they may have average or often above average abilities in other areas of learning. The third category is social, emotional and mental health, and this is the one that used to be called emotional, behavioural and social difficulties, and this encompasses a wide range of issues. So it would include those children who have a diagnosable mental health condition which is impacting on their ability to function and learn at school. And it would also include children perhaps who've had attachment difficulties. Maybe they had a very difficult early childhood, they may have been adopted from care, they may be in care now, and they've got what's called attachment difficulties, which are impacting on their ability to function successfully in school. So that could include a wide range of things. It also actually includes ADHD, because ADHD has an effect on children's behaviour, although there's a strong argument for that should be within cognition and learning. But ADHD is currently under SEMH. And the fourth one, in many ways, is the easiest one to understand, really, which is sensory and or physical needs. So somebody with a hearing impairment, a visual impairment, or a physical disability, who maybe perhaps they're in a wheelchair, maybe they've got cerebral palsy and so on, would fall under that category for their primary area of need. And again, any of those children in any of those categories may also have needs in the other categories, but it's their primary area by which they are categorized, if you like. So how is SEN identified? So again, you don't need to understand this in great detail, but it's useful to have an awareness that something called the graduated approach is used in schools. So SENCOs and other teachers should have a good understanding of this. And it's basically that circular process there of assessing children, planning what we're going to do for them, actually doing that, teaching them, and reviewing how successful that's been. And as we go through that cycle, we, as children's needs become more apparent or become, we start to identify them more, that becomes more personalised. So it becomes more individualised for a child with a special educational need. Oops, excuse me. And there are two levels of identification. At first, most children will be identified as in need of SEN support. And this is a term from the SEND Code of Practice. And this is where a child needs special provision, which is different from and additional to that which most pupils receive through high quality teaching with differentiation. So that's that requiring special educational provision that I referred to earlier. So most children with SEN are identified as in need of SEN support, and their needs can be met through SEN support without needing the next level, which is an education, health and care plan. So nationally, it's about 3% of all children have an education, health and care plan, so quite small numbers. And this is a legal document issued by the local authority. And it's for those children who haven't made expected progress despite the school or setting having taken relevant action to identify and meet their needs. So if through SEN support, a school is finding that a child is still really not making the progress that you would expect, or their needs seem to be becoming more severe or more pronounced, or the gap between themselves and their peers is widening, then for some children it's appropriate to apply to have an education, health and care needs assessment. Not everybody who is assessed for that receives an education, health and care plan, but many will, and that's a legal process run by the local authority. There are strict timescales around that. There are strict processes that have to be gone through, and a lot of a SENCO's time is often taken up with the paperwork and the assessments and the meetings and so on that are required by children who are undergoing that process to get the education, health and care plan, which is usually known as an EHCP or an EHC plan. So you probably have some children within your schools with education, health and care plans, but those are likely to be quite small numbers. So in a primary school, you might have 2, maybe 3 children with a plan. In a secondary school, you might have 20, 30 and so on. An important thing to note is that for almost all children who attend a special school, they must have an education, health and care plan in order to attend a special school. So if a special school is thought to be the best place for that child, they would need to have that plan in place. There's a lot more I could say on that, but if you need to know more about that, again, your SENCO will have a really good understanding of how that works within your local authority, because every local authority is slightly different in how that works. I think it's useful from a governor perspective to understand how special educational needs and disability is funded in mainstream schools, because funding is crucial, but again can be quite complicated. So I think it's helpful to set out that for you. So you'll be well aware of the age-weighted pupil unit, which is obviously the amount per pupil which every school receives. So of course, pupils with SEND will receive the age-weighted pupil unit as every other child does as well. And again, the amount that is varies considerably from local authority to local authority, and it's different between primary and secondary as well. But there is an expectation that some of whatever the child needs is funded through the ORPU. In addition to that, schools have what is called a notional SEN budget. Now, the reason it's notional is that it's not ring-fenced. Okay, the amount is usually at £6,000 per child who's been identified with special educational needs. And it will, again, there's a formula, so that amount does vary. You should be able to find out what it is in your local authority. But it's not ring-fenced. It's different to the pupil premium in that regard. So it's up to the leadership of the school, including governors, to determine how that is spent. So many schools simply add it to their overall budget and maybe use it to provide teaching assistant support, for example. Some will sort of ring fence it themselves internally, and it actually is really helpful and actually quite important for your SENCO to have an understanding of how much that budget is and how it's being spent. Because if outcomes for children with SEND in your school aren't as good as they should be, or aren't as good as you would like them to be, and by outcomes I don't just mean academic outcomes, I mean the widest outcomes in terms of exclusion rates, social emotional well-being, happiness, you know, all of those really important outcomes. If they're not as good as you would like them to be, then one of the places to look is, how's the notional SEN budget being spent? Is it really being focused on those children who need it the most? And is it being used in a way which is effective and actually having an impact on those children with SEN? Much as we would do with the pupil premium. We'd ask those questions about pupil premium. And one of the things that NASEN really would like to happen is for the SEN budget to be accounted for in a similar way to the pupil premium. But that's not the case just yet. So the third funding route is what's usually called top-up funding, although it does have different names in different authorities, but it's usually called top-up funding. This is additional funding which schools can apply to the local authority to, for those pupils whose needs aren't being met through the ORPU and the notional SEN budget. And that funding will come from what's called the high needs budget within the local authority. So the high needs budget is used to support special schools. So all pupils in special schools receive a different level of funding from in mainstream. But in almost all local authorities, there's also an element which can be used to support those children who are in mainstream schools, but who need a higher level of support than is available through the other funding routes. And again, there will be a process that your SENCO usually would go through to apply for that funding. So if you're not sure what that is, speak to your SENCO, because they should have an understanding of that. In terms of trends in SEN nationally, there's a statistical release every July. So it's really, well, if you like data, it's very interesting to look at, because it gives you that really good picture of what's happening nationally, which will give you a sense of, you know, what's happening within your school and how that compares nationally. Now, as you can see from here, the percentage of children identified with SEND, the blue line is the total, and the green line is those children at SEN support, and the orange line is education, health and care plans. You can see that there's been some variation over time. So when the new code of practice was introduced in 2014-15, you can see that that number started to dip because the definition and the categorization of SEND changed at that point. But since then, we've started to see an increase in the percentage, and particularly, although it doesn't look like very much on the graph, the orange line was absolutely stable at 2.8% for 10 years. So the numbers of children, the percentage of children with plans was stable for 10 years, but in the last 3 years, it has gone up every year. Now that has a significant effect, although we're only talking about small numbers of children. The funding wise, that has a significant effect. On capacity within special schools, that has a significant effect. And when we look at the numbers, so not percentages here, but numbers, we see that rise is even steeper because pupil numbers generally have gone up, but as well as that, children being identified with SEND have gone up quite considerably in the last few years as well. Okay, so let's have a look at expectations of SEND leadership now. Leadership in its broadest sense, to include the SLT in school, but also you, of course, as governors. So one of the things which you're probably aware of is that there must be a qualified teacher as the Special Educational Needs Coordinator, or SENCO. It's the only role in school that has to be held by a qualified teacher. Even the head teacher of a school doesn't actually have to be a qualified teacher, but the SENCO does. So you can't have a teaching assistant as the SENCO, for example. There are some types of schools who don't have to have a SENCO, but if you are a mainstream school, you do. Some special schools do, some don't. They don't have to. Each school is also expected to have an SEND governor. Some say SEN governor, some say SEND governor. I don't think that really matters, to be honest, but it's important that there is an SEN governor. So you may well be one yourself. I was one myself for years. Head teachers should use their SEND resources and expertise to support school improvement and build the quality of whole school provision. So there is an expectation that we are looking at the quality of provision for children with SEND across the school and looking to improve that, and head teachers hold most of that responsibility. When a SENCO is appointed, it's a requirement that they complete a master's level award in SEND coordination within 3 years of being appointed. Some SENCOs may come to you already having that award, but if they don't, then it is an expectation on the school that that person becomes qualified within 3 years. The SENCO should have a strategic role in relation to SEND, and the code of practice tells us that SENCO will be most effective if they're part of the school leadership team, or SLT. That's often the case in primary, but much less often the case in secondary schools, but it makes a big difference to the impact that a SENCO is able to have if they're on SLT. In terms of responsibilities specific to governors in relation to SEND, I think it is really important to say, although we have an SEN governor, it's actually the whole board that's responsible. So nobody should be frightened of becoming an SEN governor because you think maybe that means you hold all the responsibility. You don't. It's a shared responsibility across the board. It's just that SEND governor is there to as the voice for the SENCO to an extent, and to lead governors' understanding around SEND. So the key responsibilities are essentially to monitor the school's arrangements for SEND. So, for example, to make sure that there is a qualified teacher as the SENCO, to look at the SEN policy and so on. Also to provide a voice for the SENCO at board level, So it's important that the SEN governor speaks regularly with the SENCO and listens to what they say. So it offers that real support and challenge that we're expected to do as governors. And to really make sure that the needs of learners with SEND are considered as part of that strategic decision making. So when you're making those decisions as a governing body or a governing board, are you considering how those decisions are going to impact on your pupils with SEND? So it's supporting and challenging everybody, including the SENCO and the head teacher, to ensure that those needs of those learners are being met effectively. Those are really important. And if you are the SEND governor in particular, I would strongly recommend that you read chapter 6 of the SEND Code of Practice. You don't have to read the entire thing. I think it's 200 and something pages, but chapter 6 is much smaller and more manageable. And I would recommend that you have a read of that. It's easily available online. So what could we do strategically that would actually improve outcomes for our pupils with SEND? So I've already referred to this, and this is something that NASEN often asks for. We could give SEND an equivalent status to pupil premium to make sure that that funding is being spent effectively. We need to make sure that SEND is everybody's responsibility, not just the responsibility of the SENCO, but every teacher and every leader. A little bit like safeguarding. It's really accepted now that safeguarding is responsibility, is everyone's responsibility. We'd like to see SEND being perceived in a similar way. We need to ensure that every leader is a leader of SEND, whatever kind of school you're leading, whether it's a grammar school, an academy, a primary, an infant school, whatever it is. Every leader should be a leader of SEND and promoting the outcomes and needs of those children with SEND within those schools. We should be focusing on what's called co-production. So when I mentioned person-centered working previously, one of the key elements around that is co-production, which simply means working together with parents, families, and children. So it's about shifting the culture from complying with co-production. So yes, we co-produce things because when we write new targets for our children, we always send them to the parents for them to sign and agree. Now that's not really meaningful co-production. That is almost a tick box culture. Meaningful co-production would be actually getting together and developing those targets along with parents and families. But that's a real culture shift. And then maximising the impact of the SENCO. So making sure that your SENCO is qualified, making sure they've got the NASENCO qualification, making sure that they're on the senior leadership team, making sure that they have the time to actually undertake their role really effectively. So I just want to give you a moment to reflect, and if you need to, take a quick comfort break, although it is not far off 7 o'clock, so hopefully you might not need to just reflect on those questions for a moment. And maybe those are questions to consider at board level or to have a conversation with your SENCO about. Okay, so I just want to finish off with how NASEN and Whole School SEND support you as governors and you as school leaders as well through free resources. Everything that I'm talking about is entirely free to access online on either the NASEN website or the Whole School SEND website. So we produce a set of review guides. These are some of them, these are the ones which are particularly relevant to governors and other school leaders. So they're really to help you do a self-evaluation of whatever you think is the most important area for your school. So it might be that you're not sure whether your deployment of your SENCO is effective, or you don't know how effective it is, or you don't know what you could do to make it more effective. Then go to the Effective SENCO Deployment Guide, and that will support you with that process. Maybe you want to understand how inclusive you are as a school. So you'd go to the Demonstrating Inclusion School, which really looks at leadership across the board. or you want to actually have a look at governance of your school and how inclusive and SEND friendly that is, then you would go to the SEND governance review guide. I'll send through, as I mentioned at the beginning, links to these in the document following, probably tomorrow, to be honest. If you have a new or a less experienced SENCO in school, then we have what's called the SENCO induction pack, which is a handbook really to how to be a good SENCO from day one. So it gives a really good overview of the role, because most people who start that role don't know very much about it, and you often feel that you're thrown in at the deep end, and you can feel like you're drowning because there's a lot of demands on a SENCO. So this can really help new and less experienced SENCOs to sort of hold their hand and guide them through some of the things that they need to understand and that they need to be doing to do their role effectively. Adam Bodison, who is the chief exec of NASEN, who you may have heard of, has written a book recently. It was just published earlier this year on governance. He is a governor himself. I think he's a governor at 3 different schools and a trustee of a MAT as well. So he's a highly experienced SEND governor. And this book, this isn't free, I have to say. This is a paid for book, but you can get a 20% discount using the code that's on the slide there. It's published by Routledge on behalf of NASEN. We have a whole series of books that we publish, and it comes highly recommended. I've read it myself. I was a SEND governor for 10 years. I've been in special education for more than 25 years, and I found it really, really useful. So strongly recommended. But there are free things available if you don't want to spend money on that. We have produced lots of resources during the last year in response to the COVID situation that we've all found ourselves in, and they're all available on the SEND Gateway. Again, I'll send the links through. So we have a COVID-19 SEND review guide to support schools with the response to lockdowns, particularly the impact that that's having on children with SEND. There are also some downloadable leaflets produced in association with the NHS to support around those children who are returning to school after a period of absence, whether that's through lockdown or through perhaps a health related issue, and also to support current year 11s, both last year and now this year as well. It's continuing to impact on year 11s, in particular those with SEND. Thinking about their next steps can be really challenging. And then this is quite a weighty tome. This is a handbook around having successful returns to school, again available for free on the SEND Gateway. So what have been the impacts of lockdown? Now, no doubt you can think of many yourselves. So I'm thinking particularly in the short term on our children with SEND. Transition. Many children with SEND find transitions particularly challenging, whether it's a transition from one school to another, or a transition from one teacher to another, from one class to another, but also transitions within the day as well. So from home to school, from lessons to break, from assembly to dinner time, whatever it is, all of those transitions can be quite challenging for some children, and particularly so now that things have changed so much. You know, and everything is different with masks and social distancing and bubbles and all of those things that you'll all be very familiar with. So unsurprisingly, we're seeing a lot of children experience anxiety around around everything, around health issues, around the lockdown situation generally, around the impact that it may be having on their family, but also around going back to school. What's school like now? I don't really understand how my exams are going to work. I don't know what's going to happen when I move up to secondary school because the normal activities that we do haven't taken place, for example. Many reasons why children are feeling anxious. They're also having to get used to new routines. Hopefully most children are used to new routines now, but it will take longer for some children, and some children with SEND will have needed more support around developing those new routines. We continue to see change and uncertainty. Hopefully that's reducing over the next few months. So hopefully by September and the new school year, things will have stopped changing quite as much and children will feel more confident about what they're doing, but we just never quite know. So there's that whole sense of uncertainty at the back of people's minds, not just children's obviously, but for some children with SEND that can be particularly unsettling. And many children will be sensitive to adult anxieties. So when we think about the adults who are working with our children with SEND, to the teachers, the teaching assistants, the lunchtime supervisors, the office staff, everybody that's involved in the community of a school will have their own anxieties, and many of them will be communicating those anxieties to children inadvertently, and children will be picking up on those as well. And of course, we know that many children have gaps in their learning because they weren't able to access online teaching. Either they weren't able to access it or they didn't access it for a range of different reasons. Many children will be suffering from a loss of skills and confidence. So if you think, for example, about a child with dyslexia, who maybe usually has a weekly lesson with a specialist teacher, perhaps they didn't access that over term during lockdowns. So they're now feeling much less confident about going back into the classroom. And those children who usually have regular access to therapies, whether it's physical therapy or speech and language therapy, many of those therapies have continued in lockdown, but often not in the same way and perhaps not as effectively. And I think one of the most important areas to focus on is really mental health and well-being. And I very, very strongly believe, and I think this has been the case actually, that senior leadership teams should be really focusing on that at this current time, and that SENCOs need to be closely involved in that, because SENCOs will have a really good understanding of the impact on children with special educational needs and disabilities, and particularly around their mental health and well-being. So it's really important that children with SEND are given particular consideration and a flexible approach to planning, because we can't always predict who's going to react in a particular way with their mental health and well-being. It's not always who you might think it would be. Crucially, we also need to take into account the impact of the lockdowns on staff and how it affects their responses to our pupils with SEND, and make sure we're supporting staff well-being as well. In the longer term, for some pupils, these impacts will last a much longer time. And I think we end up with four sort of categories really. So will be those children, most children didn't have SEN previously and make a quick recovery. Thank goodness. Let's hope that that is most children. However, there will be some children who weren't previously identified with a need, but who we're seeing this long-term impact that's actually, we need to start thinking about identifying those children now as having a special educational need for a range of reasons. And again, the SENCOs and other teachers need to be really conscious of that and identifying who those children might be. Some children with SEND will make a quick recovery from lockdown, and their needs will continue in much the same way as they were prior to lockdown. But some children who had a previous special educational need, actually their needs may need to be redefined. So it may be that previously perhaps they had their primary area of need was maybe around cognition and learning, but actually the impact, the social and emotional impact of lockdown has been so severe on them that actually that's now taken a priority. So we may need to redefine what those children's needs are. But there are school-wide strategies that we can adopt that will support everybody with the effects of lockdown, including our children with SEN. So some schools are taking this opportunity to reevaluate their curriculum and look at what some people are calling a recovery curriculum, so a curriculum which is more focused on mental health and well-being. And actually, we know that some schools are actually really saying, well, let's throw everything up in the air. Let's look at it through this new lens, this new understanding that we have. And actually, let's look at whether we need to adapt our curriculum. I think something that worked, most schools did really well during lockdown, was to have effective communication with families. And I think it's really important that we continue to do that. And that was made easier through the use of Zoom meetings and other virtual environments, more phone calls. And I think we shouldn't think we've got to ditch all of that and go back to traditional face-to-face meetings, but actually we can continue with some of those effective communication methods. And for me, particularly for our children with SEND, but actually for all children, maybe we need to take a step back from that focus on academic progress and look at making sure that children are feeling safe and secure and confident in school, because we know from our understanding of the hierarchy of need that actually until you feel safe and secure, you can't learn. So we need to really be looking at that and looking at how our children are coping mentally and emotionally. Just some very recent research, again, I'll share the links with you, that you might be interested to read if you want to delve a bit more deeply into this. This was published by the University of Sussex, and this was actually looking at the possibility of some children with SEND continuing to access some of their learning remotely. Because for many children, actually lockdown was a very positive experience because they were able to spend more time at home without the social demands of school, and as this one parent who was quoted here, in their own clothes without having to be in school uniform. So less sensory stimulation, different expectations. Actually, some children really benefited from that. So what can we learn from that, and what positives can we take away from that for some children? NASEN supports Bath Spa University to conduct a SENCO workload survey every year. And again, you can have a look at that if you're interested. And one of the key findings this year was that since COVID and the lockdowns, SENCO workload has increased significantly. So it's really important to be aware of that and to have a good understanding of how your SENCO is coping and managing with their workload and the different demands that are coming out over this last year, and which will no doubt continue. For example, having to re-identify SEN, you may be applying for more education, health and care plans. Whatever it is, I think it's important as governors that you have a good understanding of your SENCO's workload. Another recent report from the EPI was around the identification of pupils with special educational needs and disabilities, and that showed huge regional variations. And interestingly, unlike most aspects of progress, there was a big between school difference. So actually the school that the child attended had a big impact on how well SEND was identified. So again, well worth a read if you're particularly interested. So how do we support our pupils with SEND to catch up? And I've put catch up in inverted commas because I think the first question that we need to ask ourselves is catch up with what? A lot is talked about pupils catching up and closing the gaps and all of this sort of rhetoric, and yes, that's important, but I think we need to be really clear about actually what are we asking children to catch up with. Are we simply asking them to try to achieve what it says they should be achieving at their age, or do we have a realistic understanding of what that child is able to achieve with the right teaching and the right level of support? So I think it's really important to be clear about what we're expecting children to catch up with and why we're wanting them to do that. So as part of that, it's important to know what's important to our pupils and their families. And I think many of you will no doubt be parents. I am myself of older children now, but for parents, for almost all parents, It's about their child feeling happy and safe and secure and comfortable, and re-engaging with their friendships, re-engaging socially, you know, getting out in the fresh air, playing sport, participating in PE, joining in with extracurricular activities. All of those things are at least as important as the learning and the academic progress that happens. So particularly when we're thinking about our pupils with SEND, has somebody had that conversation with those children and their families around actually what's the focus for you now? How would you rather we spent some of our budget on providing you with that extra additional support in reading, or would you actually rather that was spent on enabling you to access some extracurricular activities, for example? So it's really important to consider that. It may be that learning is the most important thing for that child, and there's you know, absolutely nothing wrong with that, but it's important that we're open to other possibilities. And the crucial thing is our provision for pupils with SEND as effective as it can be anyway? Because if it is, that's the most important thing that we can do to support our pupils with SEND to catch up. So do we have an effective SENCO? Are they being effectively deployed? Is teaching of a good quality across the school? Are teaching assistants being used effectively? All of those things which enable an effective SEND provision, if they're in place, then our pupils with SEND will be supported to catch up as effectively as possible. What could we do better since COVID? How can we make positive changes for our children and young people with SEND? We can rethink how we communicate with those children and their families, as I mentioned earlier. We can make sure that we're focusing on mental health and well-being first and foremost. And we can rethink how we use virtual and online learning and take the positives and the benefits of that and see if we can incorporate those into the overall SEND provision that we offer. And I think if we think about those things and have those conversations at board level and with our SENCOs and with our school leaders, then we can really get a positive outcome of this really difficult year that we've all had, so that we can move forward to benefit our children and young people with SEND. And I will stop there, and I'm sorry it's just slightly past 7 o'clock. I do apologise. I can see we've got some questions in the chat. I will look at those. I think Claire will send those through to me, so I'll respond to those probably tomorrow in writing. I will also put on that document all the links to the things that I've talked about today, and I really encourage you to have a look on our website and make sure that you and others in school are signed up to access all of the great free stuff that we have available. Thank you.
Alex, I just want to say thank you. That's been absolutely amazing to hear what NASEN do to help us navigate so much information. It is always a challenging area, and to know where we can go and be supported with information. So on behalf of everybody, I would just like to say thank you very much, and also thank you for taking the time tomorrow as we go into the holiday period to answer our questions. We really do.
That's a pleasure. I only wish I was perhaps able to answer them now, but I realise there will be lots of questions. So yes, no, absolutely, really happy to answer those as best I can. And I would always suggest have a look on our websites with any other questions that you have, because there's lots and lots of information on there which is free to access. So that's always the best place to go if you do have any further questions, you know, in the future.
And also I would like to say thank you to everybody for attending. Please do get in touch with us if there are other events that you would like us to organise for you, burning issues. The idea for tonight came from yourselves. We're very happy to find out where we can get great speakers like Alex to come and be with us It's all about making life better for the children and the staff, but making our life easier, which as well, and being part of a great network. So thank you very much for giving up your time tonight as well.
Well, thank you, everybody, and I'll say goodbye.
Goodbye.